Alora intentionally infected the best captain with HIV to take revenge. What happens when betrayal, power, and desperation collide? How does a beautiful, successful woman go from being an inspiration to a murderer? This is a story of love turned to vengeance, a life destroyed by deceit, and a society that failed to listen. What pushed her to this breaking point? Stay with me till the end to uncover every dark twist of this tragic tale. In New York City, a corporate office building in the year 1999, Alora, a 28-year-old lady, was a picture of grace and refinement. As a flight attendant with Alixia Airlines, she quickly became a well-known figure in the skies. Her demeanor was calm and composed, her grooming impeccable, and her nature reserved, qualities that made her universally admired. Passengers and crew alike trusted her without question, drawn to her quiet sophistication. Alora was perfect, everything a woman should be. Alora's life was shaped by an unspoken truth. She had watched her mother suffer the pain of HIV from a man he loved immensely and gave her all from infancy. Alora's unknown father got her mom impregnated and ditched her afterwards with HIV. Her mother, a woman who had faced the harsh realities of poverty, lacked the financial resources to access the necessary treatments, but the medical team ensured her safety at all cost. Every day, Alora's mother struggled with her own battle against the disease, and in the process, the one person she was supposed to protect, her daughter, was silently condemned to a life of isolation and suffering, the stigmatization and pain she got from very close friends up until her mother's death. As a child, Alora never understood why her life was different. She watched as other kids played with their friends, carefree and innocent, while she remained in the shadows. Her mother's inability to get the proper care and the stigma surrounding HIV meant that Alora was often excluded, ignored, and ridiculed. She grew up in an environment of shame, constantly reminded of her mother's struggles, and her quiet suffering turned into a slow-burning resentment. A resentment that would shape her future. By the time Alora reached adulthood, she entered the world as a woman determined to make a mark, but the bitterness that had been quietly building inside her could never be fully masked. She carried the scars of her childhood, the isolation, the mockery, the silent judgment, and they hardened her heart. She felt betrayed by everyone who had failed her. Her mother for not protecting her, society for stigmatizing her, and the world for making her feel like an outsider. And then there was her deep-seated bitterness toward men, those who caused her mother's untimely death, who never saw the woman beneath the surface. Her past had taught her one painful lesson. She was never truly loved. She didn't grow up to know her dad, and her mom had recently passed away from the same deadly virus. She remembers how she suffered in her last days, hence her reserved attitude towards men. At work was a man who was on the lips of every lady. Ethan, a young and handsome, well-built captain who was known for excellence. Although he had many options of ladies to choose from, he particularly had his eyes on Alora. There was something inviting about her, and though she wasn't going to make it easy for him, Ethan still wanted to try. Ethan was her friend. He invested time in truly getting to know her and understanding her likes, dislikes, and fears. Their friendship meant nothing to her. In her head, every man was deceptive. When Alora faced challenges in the airline, Ethan would quietly step in to ensure she wasn't mistreated. He used his position and influence not for personal gain, but to protect Alora from the harshness of the corporate world, showing her that he cared for her well-being. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Ethan begged Alora to join him on a spontaneous shopping trip in Soho, a gesture that felt foreign to her, but surprisingly comforting. As they wandered through the boutique, Ethan insisted she pick whatever she liked, even encouraging her to try on a bold red dress, which made her feel beautiful for the first time in ages. By the end of the day, as they strolled down the streets of Soho, Alora realized that for the first time in years, she was beginning to believe in love again. His genuine admiration and lighthearted teasing broke through the walls Alora had carefully built around her heart. She laughed at his playful remarks and felt the warmth of his affection in a way she never had before. Simple, unspoken, but powerful. As the day unfolded, they shared moments of joy and connection, From laughing over a quirky stuffed bear in a toy store to enjoying a quiet cafe break where Ethan held her. Hand across the table. Alora had never felt so cared for, and with each passing moment, the walls she had built began to crumble. Ethan's patience, kindness, and sincerity melted Alora's icy exterior. Despite their connection, Alora never gave herself fully to him. She remained distant, unwilling to trust anyone with her heart, but her feelings failed her. Alora is now in a relationship with Captain Ethan Brooks, the airline's star pilot. Ethan wasn't just good-looking. He had a smile that could brighten the gloomiest of days and a carefully groomed beard that gave him an aura of distinction. He was the only child of the Nobel Brooks family, so his parents gave him the best life, and there were high hopes for him as the only child of his parents. He commanded respect both in the cockpit and in everyday life. But what truly set him apart was his warmth, his kindness, his sincerity, and the deep care he showed to everyone around him. To Alora, Ethan symbolized everything she lacked: respect, admiration, and a life free of the pain and humiliation she had, but a life she yearned for. Though Alora kept her feelings reserved and never had sex with him all along, there was something much darker lying beneath the surface unknown to both of them. Alora wasn't just enamored by Ethan. She was in love, but all along Alora's best friend and housemate was having a crush on Ethan, Alora's boyfriend. Claire was also a worker in Elixia, but in the engineering sector unknown to Alora, Claire's niceness wasn't without a reason. But what happened to Alora will open you up to the cruelty of the hearts. The true tragedy began one fateful Friday morning when Alora's boss, Richard Donovan, the powerful CEO of Elixia Airlines, insisted she attend the company's event. Alora, who wasn't a fan of clubbing, hesitated, but Richard's veiled threat about losing her job left her with no choice. Richard Donovan, a wealthy, well-connected CEO, approaches her desk and said, "Alora, we're having a company party tonight. I expect you there." Politely, she answered, "Sir, I appreciate the invite, but I don't club." Richard, leaning closer, whispered, "It wasn't a request. Show up or you might not have a job tomorrow." Alora reluctantly nods. The tension is palpable. Have you ever been forced into something you knew wasn't right? Alora had a choice, her dignity or her job, and fear won. What she didn't know was that Richard had other plans. He'd been watching her for some time. He admired her quiet strength and in his mind, thought she needed to be loosened up. Richard's cruelty knew no bounds. Reluctantly, Alora arrived at the high-end club in Manhattan, wearing a modest yet elegant red dress, hoping to blend in and leave quickly. The music is loud, neon lights flashing. She sticks to herself, nursing a drink. Unknown to her, Richard signals to a bartender who drops something into her drink. One sip, one moment of vulnerability, and everything changed. Alora wakes up in a luxury penthouse disoriented, her dress torn, her body aching. Her boss had paid men to have an affair with her while she was unconscious. Alora whispered, "What happened?" She pulls the sheets around her, eyes darting to the discarded suits and liquor bottles on the floor. Imagine waking up and realizing you've been used, violated, and you don't even know by how many. What would you do? Call the police? Seek justice? Alora's hand shakes as she reaches for her phone but stops. The first thought that came to her mind was to report it to the police, but something else stopped her from doing so. Her boss was a very influential and powerful individual who had connections even in government and with the police. There have been many cases of rape and money laundering that people had charged her boss with in the past, but all of it were swept under the carpets as if nothing happened. Instead, the victims suffered even more damages, like losing their jobs and tarnishing their images. She knew she was not going to be exempt. There was absolutely nothing she could do about it. But justice isn't for everyone, is it? Especially when the predator has power. But why did her boss do this? He did it because she had always proven to be a tough girl who wouldn't have an affair with anyone despite all the promises of money and promotions. What Alora hadn't accounted for, however, was how her life would take an even darker turn. Richard's cruelty had a twisted reason behind it. He has always wanted to have his way with Alora. He has always seen her as a challenge to conquer. Richard had noticed that Alora had stayed distant and had never once fallen for his charm, unlike the other women in his orbit. He had assumed it was because of Ethan, the airline's star captain, the man Alora was always so respectful toward. Richard couldn't understand why Alora hadn't fallen for him. He had already seen Ethan as a threat to his control, but couldn't do anything about him due to his level of competence on the job. But when Richard learned that Alora had never been truly in love with anyone, his frustration and cruelty only grew. To him, Alora was just another employee, a woman to manipulate and discard, and was ready to prove that. But this was not the pitiful part of the story. At Bellevue Hospital, Alora visits the hospital immediately for tests and medications. And after some weeks, she started feeling sick and she revisited the hospital. The doctor sits across from her with a grave expression. This time, the truth, however, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Miss Alora, the test results. You're infected with STDs. Her heart stopped. Her world shattered. What's the first thing you would think if you heard those words? What she was afraid of has come hunting her. Alora's breath shudders. Tears roll down as she gripped the edge of the chair. No, 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 no. She cried her eyes out. Her mother's fate had come to claim her. Grief overwhelmed her for days, but with it came a thirst for vengeance. She had nothing left to lose. The world had taken everything from her, her dignity, her childhood, her mother. Now she would make them all pay. More like she's going around a circle, but this time she won't just die like her mom. Despite her outer composure, Alora's heart was consumed with anger and a deep desire for revenge. She wanted to make those who had hurt her feel the same pain she had endured. She wanted to see them fall, particularly her boss. So she devised a plan, a quiet, invisible act of destruction. Her plan would be subtle. She would no longer seek love, no longer reach out for closure from the people who had hurt her. Instead, she would spread her pain in silence, in the most insidious way she knew. She was no longer interested in trying to change the world's perception of her. She would make the world pay, but it would never know her true hand in it. A once modest, reserved Alora now transforms. She starts dressing provocatively, giving more ears to her boss. Alora isn't reckless, she's calculating. She knew that her boss would not fall for her again after what he did to her. Instead, she slowly and deliberately maneuvered herself into his life. She learned his habits, his vulnerabilities. She began creating opportunities for their paths to cross. Casually at first, but soon it became a thing much more deliberate. She would find moments when they were alone, offering him a friendly ear or comforting words after long, tiring flights. Her calm presence was a balm to his weary soul, and her boss began to rely on her. She seduced him into bed, infected him with a deadly disease, and his wife wouldn't be an exemption at this point. Her plan had worked. Richard was infected, his wife too. But it had cost her everything. Her integrity was exchanged. And now the woman who had once been the picture of grace and refinement was nothing more than a cold, calculating murderer, staring into the abyss of her own destruction. The tale of Alora's descent into vengeance was not one of redemption, but of cruelty and betrayal that ultimately consumed her. What started as a desire for justice had morphed into a tragedy of monstrous proportions. She had nothing left to lose, and if she was going down, she was taking others with her, betrayed by love. While all this was going on, the captain grew out of love with her. His fiancée, who wouldn't go to parties, won't accept invitations from men, and won't even give out her contacts and socials, now was a very different person. She was open to anyone and started clubbing. She was going through a lot, but her boyfriend didn't seem to care. He didn't ask her what was going on or why she changed suddenly. To make matters worse, he started dating her best friend Claire, who saw it as an answered prayer. Alora used to be very proud of Ethan. They used to be the envy of others. She would brag about his academic and career achievements and how much of a sweet charisma he possessed. But now he isn't hers anymore, and now belongs to her best friend. He promised to marry her but never proposed for 3 years. But now he has been dating her friend for just 3 months and has proposed already. Things happened so fast, her life was like a nightmare. Alora watches from a distance as her boyfriend Ethan Brooks kisses her best friend Claire. Rage boils in her veins. Her friend wasn't making it easier for her. She taunted her with pictures of her and her new boyfriend on social media. What was once hers was now her friend's. Her hatred and bitterness grew stronger, and she began to sort for ways to end both their lives. Her ex-boyfriend and his new girlfriend, her best friend. She found her way to convince the guy to go out with her and hear her out, which was where she did the unthinkable. They hung out and it led to them having sex. She infected him so he could also infect his wife. But she never knew something more deadly would happen. Claire, her best friend, found out about their affair and went to her house to confront her about it, warning her to stay away from her man. But the night she confronted Alora, who had secretly harbored hatred for her because of the betrayal, everything went terribly wrong. Claire will soon find out she made the worst decision of her life. Claire, approaching Alora, said, "Stay away from Ethan. Alora, it's now my era. He's my man now, or you wouldn't like the outcome." Alora responded, "You think you can just take him from me and get away with it? You were my best friend, and you knew how much I loved him." Claire, best friend? Please. You were never enough for him. I'm everything you're not. Strong, bold. You were too busy playing the victim. Now he's mine. Alora, smirking coldly. You think he'll stay with you after what I'm about to do? Enjoy him now, because everything you've taken from me ends tonight. In a fit of rage, Alora, burning with bitterness and aggression, pulled the trigger and shot Claire before she could even say another way in defense, her anger spilling over in a moment of insanity. The silence of the apartment was shattered by the loud crack of the gunshot 4 times. Claire's lifeless body slumped to the floor, blood pooling around her. Alora's heart raced as she realized what she had just done. She panicked, unsure of how to dispose of the body. She thought about fleeing, but deep down, she knew she couldn't escape this. Meanwhile, Alora's neighbors had heard the shot and immediately alerted the police. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Alora tried to compose herself, contemplating how to hide the evidence. But just as she was about to make her move, she was met by a horrifying sight. Ethan had arrived at her apartment. He was there to stop his girlfriend from confronting Alora about their past. But instead, he walked right into a scene of devastation. His eyes widened in disbelief when he saw Claire's body on the floor, a pool of blood spreading out from the wound. The police arrived moments later, just as Ethan tried to make sense of what had happened. But it was too late. Alora's attempt to escape her past had led her to this, her final undoing. As the police handcuffed her, Alora's once composed exterior crumbled. The life she had built for years, carefully curated and designed to protect her, was now completely destroyed. Her plan had worked. Alora to Ethan, "You used me. You destroyed me. Now you wouldn't like the outcome." He never knew what she meant by that, and she was taken away by the corpse members. The virus would now silently begin its destructive journey in his body as well, though Alora realized the consequences of that fateful night. Ethan became ill, and it worsened as the day went by, but he kept pushing through, refusing to acknowledge the reality of what was happening. He trusted the doctors, and, like so many others, assumed the fatigue and other symptoms he was experiencing were just a result of stress and his demanding career. The truth, however, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. At first, Ethan didn't notice. He chalked up the fatigue to his grueling schedule. His health seemed fine, just the usual wear and tear of life in the sky. But as the days passed, something felt wrong. He started feeling weaker, drained in a way that didn't make sense. He brushed it off, thinking it was just the stress of flying. But the illness persisted, and soon, the airline began to take notice. The whispers started. Ethan wasn't the man he used to be. Something was wrong. The truth hit like a thunderclap. After a series of tests, doctors confirmed what no one could have imagined. Ethan was HIV positive. Alora's scheme had worked. Ethan's life was falling apart. The airline, unwilling to risk their reputation, made a swift decision. They grounded him. His once promising career, which had taken years to build, was now in shambles. The man who had been their best captain was now a liability, and his job was revoked. He was told to take a leave of absence, but deep down, he knew this was the end of his career. For Ethan, the diagnosis was more than just a physical illness. It was a death sentence to everything he had worked for. His career, The one thing he had built for years was suddenly ripped away from him. It wasn't just the diagnosis that hurt him, it was the loss of his identity. The face of the airline, now a man marked with a scar that no one could erase, had been discarded, but there was no way out. The burden of the disease, the loss of his job, and the public shame became too much. Alora's crime wasn't just a betrayal, it was the destruction of a man's life. Ethan, unable to cope with the mounting pressure, took his own life. The world was left reeling from the loss. It took months for the truth to unravel. Investigators began to dig deeper, noticing a disturbing pattern. There had been other men, other victims, including his boss and his wife, who had come into contact with Alora. The isolation became unbearable. The shame of it all, the humiliation of being a public figure, of being seen as a risk to the airline, drove Ethan to the edge. His once promising future now lay in ruins. He couldn't escape the thought that his life, everything he had known, had been torn apart by someone he loved. As Ethan struggled with his diagnosis and the sudden loss of everything he had worked for, the burden of public shame grew unbearable. He couldn't face the world, nor could he look at himself in the mirror without feeling disgust and humiliation. The whispers of his illness, combined with the loss of his position, turned into a weight he could no longer carry. Alone, broken, and trapped in a web of deceit, Ethan took his own life. His death sent shockwaves through the airline industry and beyond. It was the loss of a great man, but no one knew the true cause. Behind the headlines of "Beloved Captain Dies from Illness" lay a far darker truth. What the world didn't know was that Ethan was the 11th victim. Was this justice? Was this vengeance? Or was it just another tragic end to a woman who never stood a chance? Slowly, the police began to uncover the horrifying reality. Alora had done this before. She had infected at least 10 other men before Ethan. The captain was simply the latest. Each time, she weaved her way into their lives, took advantage of their trust, and destroyed them from the inside out. The revelation of Alora's actions sent shockwaves throughout the airline industry. She had used her beauty, her charm, and her position to carry out a series of calculated crimes. She had destroyed careers, ruined reputations, and ultimately taken. Her arrest was the final chapter in a tale of betrayal that was as terrifying as it was tragic. It was a story of a woman so consumed by bitterness and revenge that she would destroy anyone in her path to get what she wanted, and in the process, shatter lives. As the investigation into his death deepened, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Other men who had crossed paths with Alora were diagnosed with HIV under similar circumstances, each one mysteriously and unknowingly infected. The police were alerted, and soon a full investigation into Alora's actions began. It didn't take long for them to connect the dots. Alora had targeted those she saw as vulnerable, using her charm and beauty to gain their trust. The virus she carried wasn't just a consequence of her recklessness. It was a weapon, a tool she used to destroy the lives of men who she believed had wronged her or whom she simply wished to control. Alora's arrest made headlines, and the truth of her actions slowly began to surface. It was a crime of murder, deceit, betrayal, and cruelty. But the damage had already been done. Ethan was gone, and Alora would face the consequences of her actions in court, where she would tell the world about her pains over the years. Her name would forever be associated with one of the most shocking betrayals the airline industry had ever known. The legacy of her calculated cruelty would haunt Elixir Airlines for years to come. But for Captain Ethan Brooks, it was too late. His life was forever altered, and his story was marked by a silent betrayal that led to his tragic end. The man with the charming smile and impeccable grooming would be remembered not just for his talents in the sky, but for the victim of betrayal. But the aftermath of Ethan's death was far-reaching. For his mother, Evelyn Brooks, the grief was incomprehensible. Ethan was her only son, her pride and joy, the one person she had poured all her love and hope into. The shock of his death was more than she could bear. She had been there through his childhood, had watched him grow into the man he had become, and now she had lost him in the most tragic of ways. Evelyn's health had never been perfect, and the news of her son's death sent her into a downward spiral. She had always been a resilient woman, But this blow was too much. Her heart, already weakened by years of emotional strain, couldn't handle the shock. In the days following Ethan's death, Evelyn's health began to deteriorate. The grief weighed heavily on her, and she fell ill, unable to shake the emotional and physical toll of losing her only child. She was hospitalized soon after, as her health rapidly declined. Her body seemed to give up, unable to withstand the overwhelming sadness that gripped her. The doctors were baffled. It wasn't just the sorrow, it was the suddenness of the decline. Evelyn's spirit was shattered, and so too was her health. She passed away quietly, just weeks after Ethan's death, succumbing to the overwhelming sorrow and heartbreak. The community that had once adored Ethan now mourned both mother and son. Alora, who had set this chain of destruction in motion, watched as everything she had orchestrated unfolded. She had gotten what she wanted. Ethan was gone, his life and career ruined, and the people who had betrayed her were left to pick up the pieces. Alora's actions had far-reaching consequences, and the pain she inflicted on Ethan, his family, and Claire would ripple through the years. Her cruelty was hidden in silence, but the suffering it caused would never be forgotten. In police custody, she had no regret and was not remorseful because life gave her the side of the coin she never dreamt of. What do you think? Could this have been prevented? Would you have done things differently? Let's discuss this in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories.